welcome. My name is Jennifer Chenoweth, and I am the museum site coordinator for the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel, which is this building. And I work in collaboration with cemetery operations, which is here Caitlin and Ryan, who manages the cemetery. So what museums do is interpret history or objects. So instead of interpreting objects in the room particularly, we talk about the lives of the people buried in the cemetery. And the museum is really outdoors. So we function as a visitor center right now for the cemetery. And we try, because there aren't lots of visitors all day long like is at the Bullock Museum, to do research on the people buried here in between the time we have visitors. And there's a lot of foundational research to be done about a lot of people here because there are over 23,000 people buried here and over 40 acres of a cemetery that goes back to 1839. So there's a lot of research yet to be done about many, many people. When Angela gives the outdoor tour, she's going to talk about the cemetery and the section of the cemetery that this chapel sits in, which is the historic colored grounds. But I'm going to talk to you first about the particular history of this building because it's a difficult history. And the city wants to be really transparent about the difficult history. And we consider ourselves a site of memory and a site of conscience, similar to a Holocaust museum or a slavery museum, because even though this building is at the moment very beautiful, it has a very ugly past. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. In old pictures, we get some clues because there aren't a lot of great records. And there are lots of people who've tried to dig through and find every bit of detail. And maybe some of that has gotten lost. But the records that we do have, including written record books and some old photos, tell a certain story. This monument is right across the street. These days, it has a marble wall around it that was put in the 30s. So this picture predates that wall. And you can see a tiny bit of the chapel, I believe, here in this corner. And back there is a house. And it's really hard to tell if that house was on the grounds here, but we do have an old map that showed a footprint of a house next to the gate over there. And it's kind of impossible to do a digital measuring of this distance to know if that was the house or if that was where the Denny's parking lot is now. But the cemetery was more wooded, had a lot more trees, and was kept like a garden in previous decades. And over time, it has changed a lot. So the chapel, like I said, the cemetery was founded in 1839, and the chapel was built in 1914 in the Jim Crow era. There had been an auxiliary women's group who did fundraising and projects at the cemetery that you can see ads in the old newspapers where they were trying to raise money to build a chapel. And they got architect Charles Page. Did I say that right? My memory's been a little foggy this week. We've been busy. Charles Page did the designs for this Gothic Renaissance chapel. And it has all of the details of Gothic architecture, including all the Rollo triangle windows and the Gothic-shaped windows and doors. But then the city took over the project and funded the building and construction of it in 1914. I'm not sure what year they started or it happened all at once, but it was completed in 1914. There are old maps that show some information here and a few scattered headstones, but we don't have any old maps that really show records of exactly where burials are. And we know that there are thousands of people buried in this section. And there are headstones that give us a few clues. But there are only about 300 monuments in this 3-acre section. And we think that's about 10% of the burials. So a little bit of context is this aerial map is a computer-generated drawing overlay. The white rectangles are an overlay of the aerial map. And that is a representation of what it would look like if 2,400 burials were randomly placed in this area. That's how full this section of the cemetery would be. To the eye, there are only 300 markers out there, which we've surveyed and done mapping and research about. And so the candles on the stage also represent that same number. But we think that's kind of a smaller number, and we're working on auditing the records, and we'll end up with an exact, well, strike that word. There will never be an exact number, because as you go through the records, we'll find we have a monument, right? But that person isn't in the records anywhere. And then we have thousands of records that don't have any monuments. So there are omissions and errors all throughout the records and history. So there won't ever be an exact number, but we can get closer to what we have now. We currently have a National Endowment of the Humanities grant, and we're creating a digital 3D model of the space with a corresponding geospatial database about all the records, and that includes an auditing of at least 4,000 records that we're going through to try and put kind of a digital filing cabinet on all the future ancestry and research that we get from descendants as we contact them, and things that we find by doing genealogy work. So each of those files will have a folder where we can store things as we find out things going forward. It's like a big digital filing cabinet. So that's one of the projects that we're doing, and that is the context of this building. So what we do here, staff and I'm the only full-time person here, and I have several fabulous part-time people who help me, is we do research and we create digital history exhibits about these people. We usually publish those exhibits quarterly, 4 times a year, and you can see that we've got 2 of them up here on the screens, and they're kind of like a digital book. But we'll launch our next exhibit this summer called To Change, and that will hopefully wrap up our grant project, the model and the auditing of records. And it talks about the demographic change of Austin over time, because it's very different now than what it started as. For example, in 1870, the African American population was 36%. 36%. Very different than today. And we want to look at the changes that have occurred and think about all those people that are buried here. So that's a little bit of context of what you're looking at. When they built this building, it was to be a mortuary chapel to hold funerals for burials on site. And at the same time, in America, the funeral industry arose, right? So it started being used less often than it had originally been planned for. And in the 1940s, they did a renovation of the building in which they took out the wood floors that were here then and put in concrete floors, and then used it as a sales office for the cemeteries. That was before Austin Memorial Park was part of the city's office space, I believe. So that's what it looked like in the 40s after that renovation. And then over a few decades, it became the grounds crew locker room and offices, and where the contractor, who we didn't have a cemeteries division at that time, and this is where they officed. So this is this room. At that time, it had drop ceilings and a lot of boarded up walls, and they had walled off a section here so they could put a window AC unit in. And the back space, they had knocked a hole behind the stage and put in bathrooms that were accessible to the grounds crew. And then it was boarded up and in pretty bad disrepair for a long time. And several community members got very frustrated with the city for not taking better care of our cemeteries and created a friends group called Save Austin Cemeteries. And their advocacy was to care and preserve all the burials, the headstones, but we also had a terrible fence and it falling down, well, not falling down, but poorly repaired and kept building. So this is what it looked like before the remodeling that was planned to start in 2016. So with the advocacy of Save Austin Cemeteries, Kimberly McKnight put together a cemetery master plan in 2015. There was bond money that came in 2016, and the plan for rehabilitating this building was begun. But I think it was at the end of November 2016, the contractors and the archaeologists were on site when they went to dig the first hole, and they hit bone. So all construction stopped, and the archaeologists spent almost a year working on this project as an archaeology project. Often led by Ora Houston and a lot of other community members, before any big decisions were made, we tried to do our best to do outreach to the community to see what they wanted done. There were some opinions that we should knock down the building. There were some opinions that we should put in a glass floor. But the majority of opinions were that we should exhume the bodies and rebury them as close to the chapel as possible. So while that work was being done, they did a process called soil scraping, where you take a backhoe and you drag off the top layers of topsoil to look for things called soil stains. That sounds really gross, but it's not the staining of the dirt. It is where the grave diggers at the time would have dug a rectangular cubic hole and dug out the dirt, and when they put the casket in, they backfill the hole, and the dirt is mixed and is a different color and texture than the surrounding dirt. And so they did soil scraping all around the chapel and inside the chapel to try and determine where pre-existing graves were. They first came in, so that is a view that way, right? And mechanically dug out with a backhoe the concrete floor, as well as the top layers of soil, which had been added to put in the concrete floor, as the wood floor floats over a crawl space. And then after that, they began doing the digging by hand. That is the view of that back wall. There's a door there behind our AC unit now, and that's where the doors in for the bathroom had been. They're a differently colored area, and here, if you can see it, there are these kind of pink string outlines of where they found burials. And the building was built on top of burials. It wasn't that the building was here and there were burials within a planned footprint. So even along that wall, this wall bisected several burials. And there were several burials in this room. There's still a burial that's under that front wall that they were unable to exhume and I'll show you where that is in the footprint of the building. But they took their time and they worked very carefully trying to find every bit of artifact, what you call hardware, from the coffins, as well as any artifacts that were buried with the people. And so that's a little bit what it looked like here when they were digging. They would do one grave at a time and document and photograph every single detail. And we have a published archaeology report on our website if you want to read the whole thing. And as well, we have a digital exhibit up where we go through a lot more pictures than this. This is kind of trying to be the brief version. So this is the footprint of the building. And these dark orange, this is Dario Nanez, where the headstone is back there. And there was one here with curbing around it that is still there. And all of these light blue ones were discovered burials that were not exhumed. And then all the green burials were exhumed. And this behind the chapel were left in place. They had a plan to put a handicap parking space there and sidewalks, which they abandoned in the remodeling project. But they did soil scraping here and did not find other soil stains here. And so we were hopeful when it was time to rebury them that we'd find space here, and we did. So one of the things you'll note on here is there's a planned water line right here. And you can see, in the archaeology report, it kind of goes in detail that this is the ground level grade, right? So that, I can't tell you if that was exactly 6 feet, but it's deep. It's deeper than some. And then when they were actually working on putting in this new water line in, because the water line they put in the 40s actually damaged one of the graves. And so they were rerouting the water line to go out here and into the street. And they were digging a trench here and impacted a grave there, which I'll show you in the next photo, is not 6 feet deep. So that was a very unexpected and a terrible thing. So they moved the trench line over a little bit and put the new water lines in there. So this diagram shows the date of the hardware and the personal items that were found. Obviously, if the building was built in 1914, everything predates that. But we think it predates it more than that a bit, but we don't have an exact date for that. The personal items, like jewelry or buttons, are dated in blue, and then the hardware are dated in black where we know it. And that's where all the burial locations of the exhumed graves are. These are in the exhibit and in the archaeology report. We've got lots of other pictures of the hardware and the personal items that were found in each grave. And some of the buttons were manufactured in a certain year in a certain factory, so that helps give kind of a range of dates for objects. So this is the grave that the water line damaged, and there were no remains in that. And so even though it's an adult-sized grave, we don't know anything about that person because there weren't any remains left. This diagram talks about the burials in terms of their ethnicities. And at the time, the record keepers had columns that they drew in the books, and they would list people as black, white, or Mexican. That was it, those 3 categories. And everybody was like checked off in a box in those 3 categories. That's not exactly how we talk about people today, but that's how this key is listed, is in reference to those original records. So once the bodies were exhumed, we partnered with the Texas State University Forensics Lab in San Marcos, and we transported the remains there, and they did bioarchaeology analysis in their lab and used it as a teaching tool for students. And it took a little while to get the results back because we were on more of a teaching schedule than a purely research schedule. But it was an interesting and very diverse mix of people. When the city first discovered this problem, it had been assumed that it was primarily African-American graves in this entire area. But Save Austin Cemeteries had done some research and pointed out that there are several graves nearby in Spanish, monuments in Spanish and monuments in German, and matched those to some of the record books. And so even though we don't have a map or any conclusive information of exactly where sections and subsections of this segregated section of the cemetery are, there are areas that were set aside for city grounds, county grounds, paupers grounds, Mexican grounds, and if I didn't say it already, strangers grounds, which would have been recent immigrants or people new to town that didn't have friends or family to bury them. So we think this section of the cemetery is kind of an overlapping or adjacent area of some of those burials because of the adults that were able to determine through bioarchaeology their ethnicities were 6 black, 6 white, 6 Hispanic, and 1 Asian. So that was kind of a question for a lot of us once the bioarchaeology analysis came in. And once that report was released, we did a 2-day symposium called All Together Here. And it was during the first fall of COVID, so we did it all online, and there are recordings that you can watch to interpret the results of this report. And from that event, the community asked for DNA and isotope research. So then we were able to forge a partnership with the University of Connecticut's Ancient DNA Lab. And they're doing the DNA work on this project for free, which is great because DNA work is kind of difficult and expensive. And so the results of that aren't done yet, but they've finished the collagen samples. And in fact, there's a really interesting mix of people with wheat and rice-based backgrounds, which means Europe and Asia, versus corn-based backgrounds, which means North and Central America. So that actually matched with the Asian one that person had a wheat or rice-based diet. And we look forward to that project being done so that we can share the results of that. The ethnicities were indeterminate for the juvenile and children and infants because their bone density and remains weren't such that could be analyzed and get enough scientific information to know about them. So that is a difficult set of information. But this is the list of people that were exhumed and what we know about them so far. We don't know who their descendants are. We hope that once we do the DNA research, we can reach out to some of the descendants we do know and potentially find a match. But the context of these 36 people within this many or many more is, it's not promising that we'll find all or many of the descendants of these people, but we would like to still try. And so this report, this list from the forensics lab's report, but I've reordered it to match where they were reburied. So after the DNA samples were taken, the remains were returned to the Texas State University lab grouped with the children and infants. And they built smaller container boxes because they didn't need to be full coffin sized. And we contracted with another archaeology firm to come and try and find empty space where those could be reburied. And as the community's wishes to rebury them as close to the chapel as possible, we did. So in November of 2021, we reburied them right outside of the chapel wall. And we did that with a blessing ceremony. And it was a great relief for a lot of us working on this very difficult project that we got to do that work so far. So this is reordered in the order of the burials. And if you, in a minute, want to look out the window, you can see numbers inscribed on the back for which are the key to which person. And so that's the order of this. The infants are in a group on this end, going to the adults on this end. We designed the monuments, got some community engagement feedback about the monuments, and then put that out to bid last spring, almost a year ago, not quite. And we contracted with Monument Warehouse, which happened to be out of Georgia, and they created those monuments that we've installed out there to mark their spaces. They just got installed a few weeks ago. There are still a few details left to do to finish it up. But that is the reason for having this event, is that a lot of this work has been published during when it was COVID, and we didn't have a time to gather and talk and experience this. So we had promised the public that we would have memorial events and honor these people's lives once we had the monuments in place. But we're not done. We still have a lot of research left to do. We still have the DNA results to release, and much more to do engaging the community and hopefully finding more descendants. So that was longer than I meant to talk, but thank you for listening.